The late spring sun warmed the Florida coast as Helen Richardson stood at the edge of the back porch, watching the palms sway against the turquoise sky. At 68, she still carried herself with quiet elegance. White linen slacks, a soft pastel blouse, and hair neatly pinned into a twist she'd perfected over the decades. The old family vacation home, nestled just outside Sarasota, was bustling again. It had been their tradition every June for over 30 years. Helen had spent the morning preparing the guest rooms, fluffing pillows, laying out fresh towels, and unpacking the silverware set she reserved only for family gatherings. It was their reunion weekend, a tradition her parents had started and she'd lovingly continued after their passing. Her husband, Richard, had always been by her side, grilling on the patio, pouring drinks, making everyone laugh. At 72, Richard was still charismatic, gray at the temples, full of stories, and fond of being the center of attention. Their daughter Linda, her husband Marcus, and their two children were set to arrive by noon. Others would trickle in, cousins, old friends, even Helen's sister June and her daughter Amber, who had flown in from Jacksonville. Amber. Helen smiled at the name, but there was something tight in her chest when she thought of her niece lately. Amber, 29, was beautiful and quick-witted. Too quick sometimes. She'd gone through a messy divorce just 6 months earlier, and Helen had offered her comfort like she always did. A place to stay, a shoulder. She'd always treated Amber like her own child. So when Amber had texted, "Do you mind if I come a day early, just to get away?" Helen had replied without hesitation, "Of course, sweetheart, you're always welcome." That had been 3 nights ago. Now standing in her kitchen arranging the fruit platter, Helen felt the oddest twinge of discomfort. She couldn't place it. Just little things. Amber arriving before anyone else, despite usually being fashionably late. Her seeming at ease in the home, even in Richard's armchair, sipping morning coffee with a confidence that didn't belong to a guest. Still, Helen brushed it off. Maybe she was imagining things. She chalked it up to exhaustion. She'd been on her feet since 6 that morning, baking lemon bars, prepping potato salad, setting the patio furniture just right. It was the kind of gathering where people showed up expecting warmth, laughter, and everything to be exactly as they remembered. "Honey, where's the grill brush?" Richard's voice called from outside. "In the storage bin next to the patio door," Helen replied, wiping her hands on a cloth. She walked out to find him chatting with Amber. She was wearing a pale sundress that fluttered in the breeze, laughing at something Richard said. He was holding a beer, casually leaning in. Nothing about it looked wrong, but Helen felt a prickling sensation, like static in the air before a summer storm. She reminded herself not to be silly. Richard had always been charming with family, and Amber had always adored her uncle. Helen turned to head back in when she caught something. Amber's hand lingered on Richard's arm longer than necessary. Just for a moment. Just enough. And Richard didn't flinch. Helen paused by the doorway, her heart beating a little louder than before. It was probably nothing. Amber was emotional lately. She had been through a rough year. Richard was just trying to comfort her, surely. Still, Helen kept her eyes on them through the kitchen window as she chopped herbs, the way they smiled, the ease between them. Later that afternoon, when more guests arrived and the noise of family filled the house, Helen still caught the small looks, like secrets shared between people who weren't supposed to have them. She noticed Richard reach for Amber's wine glass before Helen's. She noticed Amber quietly slipping out back after dinner, and Richard disappearing 10 minutes later. And that night, as Helen lay in bed next to her husband, she stared at the ceiling while Richard snored beside her, unaware, or perhaps uncaring. Helen had learned long ago not to react to every passing storm. She believed in letting people show you who they were. She believed in patience, in dignity. But this time, her instincts weren't settling. Something was off. And though Helen didn't yet know the full truth, she could feel it beginning to rise. The tension builds as Helen begins noticing more signs, each subtle but undeniable to a woman with decades of intuition. The next morning, Florida's coastal sun spilled through the sheer curtains of the guest room as Helen moved quietly, holding a stack of clean towels. Most of the family was still asleep after the long night of food, wine, and stories around the fire pit. The house was calm, except for the thoughts churning inside her. She paused by the living room and spotted Amber's sundress from the night before, neatly draped over the arm of the sofa. A silky, blush-colored thing, much too expensive looking for a casual gathering. Helen reached down, intending to hang it in the guest closet before the fabric wrinkled. The moment she touched it, the scent hit her. Cologne. Not perfume. Cologne. And not just any cologne. Richard's. Helen's hand froze mid-air. It was unmistakable. The same warm, woodsy musk he'd worn for 20 years. The bottle she had gifted him every Christmas without fail. Why would his scent be soaked into her niece's dress? She said nothing, simply folded the garment carefully and carried it to the guest room. She placed it gently on the bed, but the question lingered like smoke in her lungs. Downstairs, breakfast was starting slowly. Coffee brewed in the pot. A few of the grandkids gathered in the sunroom with cereal bowls and iPads. Helen was plating fruit when she overheard her granddaughter, Maddie, just 9 years old, ask innocently, "Why does Grandpa keep calling Amber his sunshine? That's what he always called Grandma." The knife in Helen's hand paused mid-slice. She turned gently and asked, "What did he say, sweetheart?" Maddie shrugged. "He said it last night when they were walking outside. I heard him say, 'You'll always be my sunshine, even in the storm.'" Then they laughed. Weird, huh? Weird. That's one word for it. Helen smiled at her granddaughter, kissed the top of her head, and went back to slicing melon. But her hands moved slower now. Deliberate, each cut sharp and precise, like she was trying to slice through a fog that had settled over her home. Later that day, she watched Amber walk barefoot through the hallway, humming. She wore one of Richard's old college sweatshirts, the navy one with the frayed cuffs. Helen had placed it in the donation pile last fall, yet here it was, wrapped around her niece's body. Amber caught Helen's eye and smiled, oblivious. Or maybe not. "I found this in the laundry room. Comfiest thing ever." Helen nodded. "Yes, that used to be Richard's favorite." "Used to be?" Amber asked playfully. Helen gave a polite smile. "Things change." The words hung in the air longer than either of them seemed prepared for. That evening, as the family gathered around the patio again, Helen sat quietly under the string lights, listening, watching. Richard stood next to Amber as she told some story about her college days, and he laughed louder than the joke warranted. She brushed his arm at the punchline. Helen glanced across the table and caught Linda, her daughter, watching too. A small frown creased her brow, but she said nothing. Maybe she didn't want to believe it either. Richard raised a toast to strong women that night. His eyes never left Amber. Helen didn't sleep much. Instead, she sat by the window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, gazing into the dark yard. She thought about their early marriage, the sacrifices, the lean years, the cancer scare 10 years ago, the way Richard held her hand through it all. She remembered Amber's baby photos, the way she clung to Helen's legs when she was little. She had loved them both fiercely, honestly, without condition. But something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and Helen could feel it, not just in her mind, but in her bones. The kind of truth women her age had learned to sense long before it was spoken aloud. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the shamelessness with which it danced in front of her eyes, expecting her not to see. But Helen saw. Every gesture, every glance, every scent that didn't belong, and something inside her, quiet for years, was beginning to rise. Sunday morning arrived with a stillness that felt out of place in a house full of family. The sun had barely crept over the palms when Helen slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Richard. She moved through the house like a shadow, straightening a chair here, collecting coffee mugs there. Old habits. She was halfway through setting the breakfast table when she realized something strange. Richard's phone was still on the kitchen counter. He never left it behind. Not for walks, not even for trips to the bathroom. It had become an extension of his hand, always tucked in his back pocket or buzzing beside his nightstand. Helen stared at the phone, her reflection faint in the black screen. Her heart thudded. She didn't mean to pry. She'd never been one to snoop. But after everything, the glances, the whispers, the scent on Amber's dress, Helen felt something deeper than suspicion. She felt a knowing, and she needed proof. Hands trembling, she unlocked it. He'd never changed the passcode. Same 4 digits they used for everything. Their wedding anniversary. Her breath caught in her throat as the screen lit up. Notifications, a few missed emails, a message from his bridge club, and then a string of texts from a saved contact named S. S? Helen tapped the thread, and there it was. Missed you last night. The hallway was too quiet. When you brushed my hand, I wanted to follow you. Still wearing your shirt. Smells like you. Still warm. She scrolled. There were photos. One taken in the mirror of the guest bedroom. Amber, her long hair pulled over one shoulder, her bare collarbone exposed above the neckline of Richard's sweatshirt, the same one Helen had washed and folded for decades. Another photo, 2 glasses of wine beside the pool, a blurred thumb over part of the lens, but Helen recognized the wine, the bottle, the striped towel from their guest closet. She closed her eyes. The breath in her chest was sharp, shallow. She placed the phone down like it might catch fire. For a long moment, she stood still. Then she reached for a paper towel and calmly wiped her hands, even though they weren't dirty. She looked out the kitchen window, watching Amber stretch lazily on a lounge chair, completely unaware. It wasn't anger that filled her. It was something colder, sharper. Grief, perhaps. But not just for the betrayal. It was grief for every moment Helen had defended them both, to herself, to others. Every time she'd silenced the voice inside that whispered, "You're being too kind, too trusting." Helen didn't cry. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the family calendar hanging beside the fridge. So many years, birthdays, anniversaries, baby showers, all recorded in her careful handwriting. Every milestone, every gathering, built on the belief that love, especially family love, was sacred. Now that belief sat shattered around her feet. A part of her wanted to storm into the backyard and scream, to demand explanations, to shout, "How could you?" But Helen had spent 68 years learning when to speak, and when silence could be louder than any outburst. She picked up Richard's phone again and sent the photos to herself, quickly deleting the sent notifications. She took screenshots of the messages. Proof. Quiet, irrefutable proof. Just as she set the phone down again, footsteps entered the kitchen. Amber. She wore a pale blue robe, her hair up in a messy bun, and a smirk that had no place in Helen's house. "Morning, Auntie," she chirped, stretching. "Smells like coffee." Helen gave her a long, quiet look. Amber tilted her head. "You okay?" Helen nodded slowly. "Fine, dear. Just up early." Amber poured herself a cup and took a seat across from Helen, utterly at ease. She had no idea. Not yet. Helen stirred her tea. The spoon clinked softly against the china. She didn't break her gaze. "I was thinking," Amber said, oblivious, "this place feels more like home than Jacksonville ever did. Maybe I'll stay a little longer this summer." Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see." And in that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. This would not end with a confrontation. No yelling, no spectacle. It would end with clarity, with truth. And when it did, it would be so calm, so undeniable, that they'd never forget who they betrayed. The house was buzzing again by midday. Cousins played card games in the living room, the grandkids splashed in the pool, and the smell of Richard's ribs filled the air. But Helen's world had gone quiet. She moved through the house like a ghost. Polite smiles, nods. Her usual warmth pulled back behind a veil of distance that no one noticed, except maybe her daughter, Linda. Linda caught her mother's eye across the patio once, furrowing her brow with unspoken concern. But Helen simply tilted her head and smiled faintly. Linda said nothing. Later that afternoon, while the others napped or took walks on the beach, Helen retreated to her bedroom. The door clicked softly shut behind her, locking out the noise of family and the scent of barbecue. She sat on the edge of the bed staring at the perfectly made comforter, and finally she let her mind go back. It had been nearly 7 months ago when Amber called in tears. Her voice had trembled on the phone, saying she couldn't bear to be in her apartment anymore, not with the divorce so fresh. Her ex-husband had taken everything, and she felt so alone. Helen didn't even think twice. Come stay with us, sweetheart, for as long as you need. We're family. Amber had arrived a week later with 3 suitcases, a laundry basket, and watery eyes. Helen had made her tea, cooked her meals, sat on the porch swing with her for hours. She even bought her a spa voucher to help her relax. And Richard? He'd always liked Amber, always called her his second daughter. Helen remembered the first time she felt it, the shift. It was Christmas. Amber had laughed too loudly at one of Richard's jokes during dinner, touching his hand with a familiarity Helen couldn't quite place. She had dismissed it. Then in February, Richard had started staying out late. Poker night, he'd said. The guys like it when I host. Helen didn't question him. She never had reason to. Not in 45 years. But then she remembered the day Amber left her phone on the kitchen island. It buzzed with a message from a contact saved as R, just a single heart emoji. Helen had picked it up instinctively, but Amber had dashed across the room to snatch it, laughing nervously. Oops, that was for my friend Rachel. Helen had believed her. She remembered a weekend when Richard said he was going to visit a friend in Clearwater. Amber left the same day, claiming to be visiting a college roommate in Tampa. They both returned 2 days later, sunburned and smiling. Now, every one of those moments snapped into focus like pieces of a puzzle that had always been sitting in plain sight. She hadn't been blind. She had just been willing to believe the best. And it wasn't because she was naive. It was because she loved them. Loved Richard, who had once sold his fishing boat to help her pay for night school. Loved Amber, who had clung to Helen's hip as a little girl, whispering, "You're my favorite aunt." The betrayal felt like a death, not just of trust, but of identity, of the image she had built over 4 decades of family, loyalty, tradition. It made her feel old in a way no birthday ever had. But grief gave way to something else. Not rage, not even revenge. Resolve. She stood up and walked to her closet. From the top shelf, she pulled down a small lockbox. Inside were old documents, bank accounts, insurance records, property deeds. She'd been the organizer of the family her entire life, and now those skills would serve her differently. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The screen glowed as she opened a folder labeled Legal. She hadn't touched it in years, not since Richard's minor health scare last decade. But now she began sorting through what was hers, what she had paid into, what she had inherited. The phone beside her buzzed. A message from Richard. "Hey, love, we're heading to the marina. Want us to bring you back something?" Helen stared at it, then typed back, "No, thank you. Just enjoy yourselves." She smiled as she hit send. It wasn't a lie. She wanted them to enjoy it. She wanted them to believe everything was fine, because Helen had one more tradition left for the family reunion, the Sunday brunch, hosted by her, always. And this year it would be one for the memory books. Only this time, it would be her memory, her story, and they would all be there to witness it. By Saturday night, the house was a blur of music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The family reunion was in full swing, nieces telling old stories, uncles belly laughing on the porch, children darting barefoot across the lawn with sticky fingers and sunburnt cheeks. But Helen moved through it all like a woman with a secret. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was focused. She had always been the woman behind the curtain, the one who made sure the linens were clean, the fridge was stocked, the folding chairs set up just right. She made things work. And now that same precision would serve a different kind of order, the kind built not from hospitality, but from truth. After dessert, as the younger ones cleared the dishes and Richard entertained the group with another famous story from his youth, Helen slipped upstairs. She moved silently, the way only women her age can, years of practice, of making herself small when others needed the spotlight. She entered the guest room Amber had been using and sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed from the photo. Helen took out her phone, opened the email she had sent herself, and began saving every screenshot, every message, every photo, every timestamp. She backed it up to her cloud, then to a USB drive tucked into a book jacket for safekeeping. She wasn't going to confront them with emotion. She was going to confront them with facts. The receipts, the photos, the call logs, Even a time-stamped security image from a hotel parking lot she had quietly pulled from their shared credit card portal. All of it now lived in a simple file labeled June. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back downstairs, Richard was joking with Amber again. She wore red lipstick and the same diamond studs Helen had gifted her 5 Christmases ago. Helen watched from the kitchen entryway as Amber leaned in to whisper something, and Richard chuckled, patting her hand like she was the one he brought into this world. Not Helen. But Helen said nothing, just sipped her tea. The next morning, Helen rose at dawn. It was Sunday, brunch day, the final tradition of the reunion. It had started with her mother, handwritten menus, fruit punch in crystal pitchers, paper doilies under each plate. Helen had carried it on for nearly 40 years, and today it would take on a different purpose. She dressed simply but beautifully, a soft lavender blouse matching linen skirt, in a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. Her silver hair was pinned up in a French twist. Her posture was straight, her face calm. She looked exactly like a woman about to host brunch, but something about her eyes had changed. While the casseroles baked in the oven and the scent of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen, Helen made one last addition to the plan. She opened her laptop and began assembling a slideshow, a tradition she'd begun years ago. Usually it was filled with photos from past reunions, babies in bathtubs, cousins at bonfires, awkward teen years frozen in time. But this year the slideshow had a second half. She added the text, the photos, the hotel timestamp. She didn't include anything explicit, just enough. Enough to say, I know. Enough to say, this is who you've become. She labeled it simply, Family 2024, Memories and More. At 10 a.m., the family gathered around the long table beneath the pergola, just like every year. Mimosas clinked, children passed napkins, and Richard gave his usual toast, thanking Helen for being the heart of the family. She smiled. When everyone settled in, she stood. Before we eat, she said softly, I've put together a little collection of memories from the past year. I thought it might be meaningful. Richard beamed. Amber nodded and sipped her drink. The laptop was already connected to the patio projector. The screen lit up against the white sheet they'd hung between two palm trees. Laughter rose as the first few slides played, photos of beach days, birthdays, silly faces. The children squealed, seeing themselves dance in the snow. And then, the tone shifted. A message appeared. You smelled like the ocean and home. I wish I could have stayed in that bed forever. Then a photo of Amber, taken in the mirror, wearing Richard's shirt. The same guest bedroom in the background. The timestamp in the corner. May 27th, 11:14 p.m. Silence fell like a stone. Another image. 2 wine glasses. Hotel parking lot. The name of the hotel visible in the corner. Richard's car unmistakable in the background. A final message. I love you. We'll figure it out after the reunion. Helen turned off the slideshow. She didn't look at Amber. She didn't look at Richard. Instead, she lifted her glass and said calmly, Brunch is served. The air beneath the pergola turned to glass, frozen, silent, fragile. No one moved. No one breathed. Helen stood at the head of the table, hands gently clasped in front of her, her posture regal and still. The only sound was the soft hum of cicadas in the distance, and the faint click of a glass someone accidentally bumped with their elbow. Amber sat motionless, her eyes wide, her face drained of color. A napkin had slipped from her lap and lay crumpled on the stone floor, forgotten. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Across from her, Richard stared blankly at the now black projection screen. His face was unreadable, pale, stunned, as though his entire soul had stepped outside his body to escape the consequences of his own cowardice. No one reached for their fork. No one dared speak. And then Helen broke the silence, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a voice steady and calm. I debated for days whether I should share that, she said, lifting her water glass. But I thought it was time we all had the same information. You know, since it's family weekend. A few heads turned, eyes darting between Richard and Amber. Helen didn't look at either of them. She looked at her daughter Linda, who had gone completely still. Her eyes shimmered with something between heartbreak and rage. Across from her, Marcus quietly pushed his chair back and stood, moving to comfort their teenage son, who had started crying. The youngest grandchild asked in a whisper, "What's going on?" No one answered. Helen placed her glass down and folded her napkin with deliberate care. "I made the lemon muffins you all love. They're still warm," she said, "and there's plenty of coffee." She turned to Linda. "Would you mind pouring the orange juice, sweetheart?" Linda stood almost robotically. "Yes, Mom." As she moved toward the drink table, Helen brushed her shoulder in passing, a silent message between women who had both just lost something and perhaps gained something else. Amber finally found her voice. "Aunt Helen, Helen stopped, turned toward her, and with that same calm voice said, "No." Just that. One word. Sharp enough to end the conversation, but soft enough to leave Amber sitting in her shame. Then she turned to Richard. "You'll be getting a call from a lawyer on Monday. I've already had the paperwork prepared. Everything you did while married to me. So we'll be discussing terms." Richard's face contorted like he wanted to protest. But what could he say? Helen's voice didn't rise, but her words did not waver. "I won't fight. I won't scream. But I will reclaim my peace. And I won't lose sleep over either of you again." She looked at the guests, some stunned, others openly horrified. "I'm sorry this happened during our gathering, but I've spent 45 years making sure everyone else was comfortable. I think I've earned one morning to make myself comfortable." Then she smiled, not cruelly, not with vengeance, just peacefully. She turned, walked into the house, and closed the patio doors behind her. No one followed. Inside, she moved swiftly but calmly. Her small suitcase was already packed. Her favorite books, her documents, her wedding ring, removed and placed inside a silk pouch, sat in her purse. Her car keys jingled softly in her hand. As she walked through the living room, she glanced once at the wall of family photos. Smiling children, her and Richard holding hands on a boat. Christmases from the early years, a lifetime. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "That woman's gone now," and walked out the front door. The Florida sun hit her skin like a blessing. Her cab, booked an hour ago, was already waiting. She climbed in, gave the driver an address just outside St. Petersburg, and rolled down the window. The wind swept her hair back gently, and as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, Helen didn't look back once. 6 months later, the salt air still smelled like freedom. Helen stood barefoot on the porch of her small cottage just outside St. Petersburg, holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea. The ocean wasn't far. She could hear the gentle crash of waves just beyond the dunes. Her garden bloomed with lavender and honeysuckle. It was a simple life, but for the first time in decades, it was hers. She had sold her share of the Florida family property with quiet precision, closed the joint bank accounts, and filed for divorce. Richard didn't contest. Not really. Not after the mountain of evidence. Not after the silence from the rest of the family who had, almost unanimously, taken her side. Amber, she hadn't spoken to Helen since the brunch. No apology, no explanation. Just shame, and the echoes of a reputation shattered by her own actions. According to Linda, Amber moved back to Jacksonville, alone. Apparently, the relationship with Richard hadn't lasted even 2 months after the fallout. They tried to make it work. They even lived together briefly. But there's no foundation between two people built on deception. And Richard? He tried to email Helen once. A weak apology about being confused and feeling unseen. She didn't reply. Instead, she forwarded the message to her attorney, and then deleted it. Helen didn't need closure from him. She had already given it to herself. Her daughter visited often now. More often than ever, in fact. Linda brought the grandkids down for weekends of shell collecting and hot cocoa by the porch. They didn't talk about the betrayal anymore. Not directly. But there were moments, quiet ones, where Linda would bring her mother's favorite pie or fix a creaky cupboard and say, "You handled it with more grace than I ever could have." Helen would smile, sip her tea, and reply, "You will, when you have to." She'd even made new friends, women from the local book club, other retirees who had lived full lives and now shared quiet evenings with wine and laughter. They didn't ask her about her past. They didn't need to. They saw the strength in her eyes. That was enough. And in the mornings, when she painted in the sunroom or walked the beach with her sandals in hand, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not for what she endured, but for what she walked away from. She had been the glue, the host, the fixer, the woman who held birthdays together and bridged fights between siblings. She'd bent over backward to make everyone else comfortable. And yet, when she'd needed grace, loyalty, honesty, they'd look the other way. And so she looked another way too, toward herself, toward the woman who had survived the ache of betrayal, not with vengeance, but with vision. The woman who didn't need to scream to be heard. The woman who showed them all who she really was, by walking out on her own terms. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber and gold, her oldest granddaughter sat beside her on the porch swing, quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Grandma, how did you stay so calm when you found out?" Helen turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Because I realized something," she said gently. "I had already lost them. The moment they chose to betray me, they weren't mine anymore. So what I gave them at that brunch wasn't punishment. What was it? Clarity," Helen said. "I wanted them to see themselves for who they really were. No shouting, no drama, just a mirror. And when you show some people the truth, they break themselves." Her granddaughter looked at her for a long moment, then leaned into her shoulder. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Helen smiled. "You'll be better." And as the sky darkened and the porch light flickered on, Helen closed her eyes, finally fully at peace. Not because everything had worked out, but because she'd had the courage to walk away, with her dignity intact and her soul unshaken.